Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started as people are joining. So, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Professor Wolff, for returning to our series. We really appreciate you being here with us. Before we start, let me just acknowledge that today is the Global Strike Day for a ceasefire in Gaza. And this is not a lecture series that is associated with any institution. So we are carrying on, but we, of course, express our solidarity with that um, strike. Some housekeeping, as usual. We will go for a lecture for 45 minutes or so, and then we will have a discussion and questions by Yanis, who's here with us, who's a PhD at the New School, and then we will open it up to Q&A by the attendees. Before I turn it to Professor Wolff, let me just give a brief introduction, even though he doesn't really need it. So today the lecture will be The Economics and Geopolitics of Imperialism Today. Professor Wolff is currently a visiting professor at the New School and Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He also taught at Yale and CUNY, and he was visiting professor at the University of Paris, Sorbonne. He co-authored more than 10 books. Some examples are Democracy at Work from 2012 and Understanding Marxism in 2019. He also published over 50 articles, scholarly articles, and over 75 popular articles. And I think those numbers are old. In 1988, he co-founded the journal Rethinking Marxism. He also hosts a weekly 30-minute program that I believe started over 10 years ago. He will correct me if I'm wrong, called Economic Update, which is produced by Democracy at Work. And finally, the New York Times named him America's most prominent Marxist economics. So there's much more to be said, but I will stop there and I will give the floor to you, Professor Wolff. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for spending time with me and listening to what it is I have to say. You were quite right. It is about 10, I think a little closer to 11 years now that we have been producing Economic Update every week for a half an hour. And much of what I would like to summarize is by saying that over the last 10 years, the ability for a Marxist analytics to develop here in the United States has been far greater than at any time in my lifetime. And you can see from my gray hair, I've been here quite a while. For those of you that are not familiar with how politics is changing in the United States, please understand that you may hear a great deal about Donald Trump, and you may hear a great deal about Joseph Biden, but the left is percolating, growing, deepening, and widening in ways none of us thought we would live to see. And so part of what my presentation is today is a reflection, as presentations always are, of the circumstances of the time and the place and the situation out of which such an analysis grows. Okay, having said that, let me briefly tell you what I propose to present. I think there are two crucial evolving developments in the world today that I want to focus on. One are the changes in capitalism, understood in terms mostly of the West, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, and so on. The other phenomena is a self-criticism emerging within the so-called socialist countries and in the socialist movements, and that these two developments are reinforcing one another, but at the same time moving towards a kind of collision, a kind of mutual coming together that I believe will be socially transformative, explosive, in fact. And if it sounds like they reinforce each other and strengthen each other and undermine each other all at the same time, well, then you understand my meaning. I am a deeply respectful scholar of Hegel alongside my Marx. And that's always present there in what I try to do, because I always found it present there in what Marx was trying to do. And I apologize in advance for being blunt and brief, but in order to accomplish what I want to get done here, I really have little choice. So let me begin with changes in the so-called capitalist world economy. And here I think there are two overwhelmingly dominant tendencies or trends. One is the decline of the United States empire, the role of the United States as economic hegemon, with all of the other kinds of domination that typically flow from being an economic hegemon. And the second thing is the decline of US capitalism, which is not the same as a decline of the empire, although the two reinforce each other. First, the decline of the empire. There are many ways to specify it. Here is one. There is a measurement made these days in which we add up the GDP of the G7, that is the United States and its allies, which are Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Up until the year 2020, the GDP of the G7 was greater than the GDP of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, before even adding those that have become part of BRICS in recent months. The year 2020 was the year when the growth of the BRICS crossed the decline of the G7. Today, total percentage of total world output from the G7, about 29%. Total GDP as a part of the world total of the BRICS, about 33%. And the gap continues to grow. We have a world economy that is not only split into these two monstrous blocks, but there is a crystal clear decline of one relative to the rise of the other. Every other country in the world has now two major wealth blocks to argue with, to negotiate with, to make deals with. And all over the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, you are watching the shifting of loyalties, alliances, contracts, debts, currency arrangements, all of that repositioning the world in a manner that continues the decline of the old centers of capitalism, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, versus the rising countries elsewhere. The second index of the empire is the record of military defeats. I mention that because it's very old in the history of empires in the world. Their decline has almost always been marked by series of military defeats. The United States' stated objectives in Korea were not achieved. Those in Vietnam were clearly a defeat. So was Afghanistan. So was Iraq. And it is crystal clear, if you understand the details, that the war in Ukraine is either lost or getting to that point of being lost literally now by the hour. And the outcome in Gaza, very unclear who, in both the short and long run, will be the losers in that conflict, too. And here I mean the United States, not just Israel and the Palestinians. Okay. What about the decline of US capitalism? Well, here I want to link it to the decline of the empire. Chinese competition is now a serious, ongoing reality here in the United States. It's a complicated competition because the level of intertwining, usually referred to as long distance supply chains, is complicated and ties many parts of the Chinese economy with that of the United States. But the stunning reality is that despite all of the political saber rattling and noise making, particularly under Trump and now under Biden, that the United States' dependency on China is unchanged, is not significantly reduced. If anything, it's going the other way. The attempt to destroy the competitor Huawei is now a disaster, as Huawei has produced a better, more marketable telephone than Apple could do. And you have in that the kind of culmination of a competition that can now rival that of the United States across the high-tech universe. And again, this is becoming clearer and clearer with every day. China is the world's manufacturing center. Are there other countries that are joining them? Yes. Copying them in some cases? Yes. But the colossus is China. And the colossus is an extremely important reality. China was one of the poorest countries on earth until it made its revolution. And its economic growth since that time has no equal in human history. It is the fastest economic development story we have. In record time, more people were transformed from rural, agricultural, old technologies into modern power industrial centers. It involved the movement and transformation in the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Comparable processes in Europe and North America took centuries to achieve. There is no comparison, and it does not look like that is stopping anytime soon. Over the last 30 years, economic growth of GDP in China has been roughly 2 to 3 times that of the United States, year in and year out, and that will be the case this year as well. Inside the United States, the reflection of all of this, the reflection of the fact that the United States, for the first time in a century, has a serious economic competitor, is ramifying across the economy with extraordinary speed. One of its consequences has been the emptying out of the manufacturing sector in the United States, which has other causes as well, but I want to focus us a little bit on the global dimensions. And this has, in turn, rearranged the labor movement, the conditions of working people, in a way that allows the repression of standards of living that could not have been done otherwise. Unions are strong in this country, the United States, in manufacturing, they were, and in the public sector, not in private services. And yet private services are all that's left for the vast majority of the American working class. Long story short, we have a rising unionization and strike movement in the United States that we have not seen here since the 1930s. And there is no decline visible at this point. Quite the contrary. We have had major wins by labor unions this year, and they are inspiring more of them next year. The level of debt of American government, corporations, and households is all at record levels. These are debt burdens for which no preparation has been made and for which no solution is available. Debt has consequences, and those consequences are weakening U.S. capitalism every day. The level of inequality continues to worsen. It has done that for the last 40 years without interruption. The three crashes of capitalism so far this century, the dot-com crash in 2000, the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and the so-called COVID-19 crash of 2020-21, all occurred with a further worsening of inequality, so that it reaches levels now that provoke intense breakdowns of social cohesion. As the critics of inequality have always said, since at least Aristotle and Plato were would-be consequences of markets and of the inequality they saw markets exacerbate. That has been the case in the last 40 years, as I say, without interruption. It produces a rage and an anger deep inside the American working class. Remember with me, please, that the great deal made in U.S. capitalism was a deal which said to the working class, we in the workplace will own you, dominate you, dictate to you, and squeeze you for every bit of profit we can. And in exchange, we will give you the means to consume. Consumption is the reward for exploitation. That's why those of you studying economics are taught from day one to assume that consumption is full of utility and labor is full of disutility, and then you draw the lines, cross them, and then sleep well at night. Doesn't work like that. Never did. But it's very dangerous if you promise a rising standard of living to a working class as its compensation for ruthless exploitation. Because when your empire declines and when your capitalism sinks, you become less able to deliver the endlessly rising consumption that you promised your working class. And that makes the working class very angry. The United States is being torn apart as a society by that anger. Much of it turns to the right politically, to Trump, to white supremacy, to a whole host of hideous social phenomena. We should not be surprised because the right wing has always been favored within US capitalism. The anger will turn to the left later. That's already happening, just not as much as it has initially gone where it is safer to go in this country, namely to the right. Where all that will lead, your guess is as good as mine. An angry working class can be manipulated by demagogues to support Brexit, to support Wilders, to support Trump, and you can finish Le Pen and all the others that are circulating these days. So that's an extreme decline of a hegemon. And it's troubling for the world because the United States has been the dominant player, at least since the Second World War, arguably for the last century. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is socialism. And here I want, again, to be brief and to remind you that socialism begins in its modern forms in the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th, it was mostly a critique of capitalism, formulated by individuals, by social movements, and eventually by political parties. In the 20th century, socialism as critiqued was developed further. It became global and not so much concentrated in the old centers of capitalism. But it also made experiments in governing societies. And in those three types of experiments, that I want you to think about with me for a moment, and then we'll connect them to the decline of the US empire. There were three kinds of experiments. One kind I'm going to call, just for simplicity, Scandinavian or Western European socialism. Here's what the word seems to have meant. Enterprises would be left in the hands of private owners, private individuals, singly or in groups, masses of individuals as shareholders, but private individuals. But there would be a government controlling and regulating private individuals in their business relationships, their market relationships, and so on. And that would make for capitalism with a human face, capitalism less harsh than it might otherwise be, absent the socialist government which runs it or controls it. The second, quite different notion of socialism was what emerged in the Soviet Union after 1917. There, the government goes considerably further. It takes over, as in property, industry, to some degree also agriculture, but never as completely as industry. The government there owns and operates the enterprise. There is no place, or only a very marginal place, for private enterprise. And then there is the third kind of socialism, and that is the People's Republic of China, which, for simplicity, is a hybrid of the first two. In China, roughly, you have a half of it, more or less, private, half of it, more or less, government owned and operated. In other words, half Scandinavian, half Soviet, with a powerful Communist Party and government supervising, managing, and controlling the hybrid. And of those three, as of now, by far the most successful has been the Chinese. The other two did not achieve comparable economic growth, and the other two did not demonstrate yet their long-term sustainability. The Soviet model is gone, and the Western European Scandinavian model is under long-term attack and is shrinking, at least for the moment. Neither of those problems afflict the People's Republic of China for the time being. All of those experiments, having whatever else they've accomplished, and they accomplished much in each of those models, much was accomplished, but they did not achieve the kind of socialist future that most socialists in the world had imagined, had hoped for, had dreamed of. That's part of the reason why the socialisms of the Soviet type and of the Scandinavian type have had such a hard time in the last 40 years. Shrinking, dying, vanishing, being overthrown. Socialist parties in Europe are shadows of what they once were, etc., etc. So socialism has engaged in a self-criticism for quite some time in a variety of forms across the world. One of the results of that ongoing self-criticism is relevant to my story. What it says is that the shortcomings of the existing efforts at actually existing socialism, those three kinds I summarized for you, one of the key missing elements, under-theorized and under-transformed, was the internal organization of the enterprise. In other words, the great debate across the world for much of the last century has been the debate about the relative importance of the state versus the private sectors, of state entities and private entities, and all the rest that you're familiar with. What I want you to think about with me is that the critique of socialism could have, and in my judgment should have, extended into the internal structure of capitalist enterprises, factories, offices, stores. It could have and should have directly attacked that structure as being particularly connected to class society, and that therefore would be incompatible with socialism sooner or later. To say the same thing another way, the actually existing socialisms took over the capitalist organization of enterprise, a tiny group of people at the top, the owner, the starter of the person, the entrepreneur, the whole image of an individual doing this. or a small board of directors, 10 or 20 people presiding over an army of employees. Socialists seem to imagine that that kind of organization of the workplace is not theoretically vulnerable, cannot be abolished, must be there, cannot be otherwise. That socialists accepted a capitalist organization of the workplace out of which they grew, these socialists, and that they would have to keep it. And I'll illustrate it by saying that whether you're in the private or public sector in Scandinavian socialism or in the Soviet system, any enterprise in industry, or today in China, public or private, you will see the same basic organization of the enterprise. So the self-criticism of socialism goes simply this way. But rather than making it a hypothesis, let me perhaps surprise you by a literary reference which gets at the same thing. In 1863, a Russian novelist named Nikolai Chernyshevsky wrote an amazing novel called What is to be Done? Question mark. It's a work of socialist feminism, having a great deal to do with the social activity and insights of its heroine, Vera Pavlova. So powerful was the image of a new society that a few decades later, in 1902, Lenin, in the midst of his revolutionary activities, wrote a crucial pamphlet which he chose to title, What is to be Done? And 20 years later, in 1922, after the revolution, he returned to that pamphlet and wrote a crucial answer. And the answer he came up with was the importance in Russia in 1922, the year when finally they expelled the invading armies that tried to destroy the revolution. They had defeated the White Army. They were now ready to embark on the construction of socialism. He writes a very famous essay on the importance of worker cooperatives to the future of Soviet development. A worker cooperative is the alternative to the top-down hierarchical structure of capitalist enterprises that socialists could have and should have rejected as their basic organization. Had they done that, the socialist movement today could be positioned to make the following bold assertion. The old slogan, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, takes on a new and urgent meaning. Because workers in the United States, like workers in China, have something fundamentally in common around which to unite to become unchanged. And that is to recognize that the struggle of socialism for a new and different, better way to live a life requires, at this point, not further debates about public versus private. That's no longer the key issue. Whatever it achieved as the way for socialism to spread, and it certainly achieved that a great deal over the last 2 centuries, that's not the urgent issue now. That's the lesson that socialism's history has taught us. The working class in the United States and everywhere else, the employees of this world, have a shared opponent, and those are the employers. Whether those employers are private or public is secondary. It's the relationship between them, the relationships in and of production, that once again become the focal point for our socialist movement, which can and should say, we are the end of class division. Slavery had masters and slaves. Feudalism had lords and serfs. Capitalism had employers and employees. Note the parallel. Socialism is the end of all of that, which is its power, its uniqueness. It's not only the rejection of capitalism, but its very formulation at the level of the workplace allows a breakthrough that can mean a common struggle of workers everywhere, public and private, east and west, around a common objective that all will, of course, understand in their own unique way, subject to time and place and circumstance, and on the basis of which a new and different global economic arrangement can be established. In my judgment, and this is the conclusion, this is an alternative scenario for where we go, for how we answer in our time and place the question, what is to be done? Because meanwhile, those who run a declining American capitalism and their allies are making a very different choice. They are trying to figure out, and some of them will even tell you so honestly, whether they confront a decline of the empire that is irreversible, or whether it can be reversed. And by reversed, they mean a nuclear confrontation with the People's Republic of China. Everything else going on are secondary skirmishes for them around that central question. And for those of us who would rather a peaceful alternative of some sort of live and let live between the declining empire and the rising one, that will not be much more than a pious and politically weak hope, unless it is grounded in a powerful socialist movement that is working to reorganize a world economy and not just wait for these two behemoths to figure out whether and how they can tolerate one another. I've taken my 40 minutes. Let me stop. I hope that this has provoked you. If not, let me know. If so, give me some encouragement and some feedback. I would appreciate it. And as always, for those of you who need it, I can do all of this with algebra and mathematics if you wish, and that will make me sad, but may help you understand what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolff. This was great, always thought-provoking, to say the least. I will give it to Yanni now, give the mic to Yanni to do the discussion and some questions, and then we will move to Q&A.
Sure. Thank you very much, Hani, and thank you very much, Professor. I mean, actually, Hani, you stole what I wanted to say, that it's actually very thought-provoking, as always. It's not the first time, but it's always fascinating to hear Professor Wolff. So I have thought of actually reflecting on two levels and asking two questions. So perhaps I can start with the first reflection, the first question, then perhaps Professor Wolff can then take it from there. And it's what is always interesting about Professor Wolff is that he's always in the heart of contemporary anti-capitalist debates, and that's something that I personally really appreciate about him. So as was mentioned, it is undoubtedly a moment of important shifts, and very clearly we see the escalation of imperialist contestation, right? And as was mentioned, some are in a sense noting that the US hegemony is secure. Maybe they're frightened about what is actually happening, and others perhaps are a bit more optimistic of the fall of the American behemoth. And because I also know that Professor Wolff really appreciates philosophy, and also Hegel was mentioned, of course, by extension Marx, I would like to bring back to the discussion this dialectical law, or this dialectical thinking that says that one has to look for these quantitative changes that will eventually lead to a qualitative break. And perhaps what we're seeing now, I could say and reflect on that, is a thread of small or bigger quantitative changes that unfold on all different levels. That is not only productive, financial, of course, monetary, political, but also military. And now we see that what we see actually is that these quantitative changes that question US hegemony are not uncontested by the core. So what we actually see is that we have quantitative changes also within the core that try to challenge these changes. One could think, for example, and that was mentioned, manufacturing, and especially green manufacturing, the production of green energy, what is happening in China, and what are the responses on this issue from the core, both Europe and, of course, the US, and of course, Japan and other advanced capitalist nations. And the question here that it is quite daunting, one could say, is what is the form, what are actually the different forms that this qualitative change can take and will eventually take? And I think that can be a frightening question. Now, going to the second aspect of my reflection, which I also appreciate, and I know that Professor Wolff has a deep knowledge of economic history. And as was mentioned in the discussion, no hegemony is eternal. And to the extent that hegemony is solid and strong, it's in the same time written with contradiction, and at the last instance, it's also fragile. Now, if we go back and learn from history on the fall of British hegemony, we see the rise, of course, of the US power. We see that the US starts essentially as a peripheral country, but on the late 1900 and early 20th century, we see a huge development, right? Maybe Professor Wolff can actually talk about this shift. Now, what we see now, and I also know that Professor Lapavitsas is making this point very strongly, is that perhaps for the first time, we don't see a contestation of the hegemony coming from another core economy, but actually from a peripheral economy. And I would like to ask on this first part of the reflection, what Professor Wolff thinks of this importance, whether you find this important, And if you think that there are different characteristics in terms of contestation now coming from the periphery and not from the core. So that is the first aspect of the reflection. You can answer and then we can continue. Thank you.
So many things in what you have to say. I'm a little taken with so many things that I would want to respond to. First, let me say a little bit about the United States. You are quite right. There's a simple notion of quantity versus quality that's very old, as if these were two different things. And as you know from the logic of Hegel's thinking, he only separates them in order to then be able to tell us why and how they're not separate. You know, it's the old notion, you break things into a part because you want to understand how they are not broken apart in how they actually appear. You analyze, you break apart to understand the linkages among them all. And quantity and quality are linked that way also. It's never this simple story. I remember when I first learned this, we were told about water. You know, water gets warmer and warmer as a liquid, and then it becomes, at a certain point, it changes into a gas. Well, if you know a little bit about atomic energy and chemistry, you'll know that as the temperature rises, all kinds of things are qualitatively changing in there too. May not be the physical form that the human being sees, liquid and gas, but that doesn't mean there isn't qualitative change. And that's all. I mean, Hegel, before chemistry, Hegel understood that also. So yeah, there have been changes here in the United States. For example, the more difficult it becomes to raise the standard of living, the more difficult it becomes to control young people. The dichotomy between older and younger people in the United States is extremely strong right now. And one wonders, why is that? And the answer is that the young people for decades now have grown up very dissatisfied with what their parents' life was like. This living, working like crazy, and then going to the mall to shop like crazy, and dividing your life between these two activities with little left for much else. But they consoled themselves because their parents conveyed the ideology of the time: consumption is your reward for labor. Go to the university, you'll get a better job, you'll earn more money, and you'll be able to consume more, period. These young people now confront an economy in which this is not the case. They will not live better than their parents. They will not live at the same standard of living their parents will achieve. And there's no prospect for that to change. People are expecting to have 3 or 4 part-time jobs. You have that all over Europe as well, and no doubt beyond. The promises capitalism made are not being delivered. And this is transforming everyone. For example, again, just so you see, you're constricting the standard of living, for example, of college teachers and professors like me. Most American colleges and teachers now are what we call adjuncts. That's basically a polite term for a part-time, underpaid, overworked, harried individual. And the graduate students heading into that job are very angry. And what they've done in the last 2 or 3 years is amazing. They've joined unions. They've formed unions in a way no academic core of people in this country ever did before. I myself was part of many efforts to organize students and faculty that did not work. Now they work. And you know what that means? It means that this new emerging generation of college and university teachers will be more critical of capitalism than anything that has existed in this country up until now. And I'm including the short time that radicals got into the university during the Great Depression in the early 40s, when it did happen, but not like this. Not on this scale, not in this general way, not across the country in every region. It's extraordinary what is going on. And we are watching qualitative interacting with quantitative changes to undermine. The people who run the United States are aware, not of this or that detail so much, but of a generalized sense. And let me say it as ominously as I know how. It's over. The American self-delusion of perpetual dominance is over. It's not there anymore. Oh, there are still people who talk like that, and no doubt many who hold on to these beliefs. But that's what they're doing, holding on, and those around them, even those who agree, have this feeling it's over, and there's nothing we can do. The miscalculation in Ukraine is very important. They had no idea, even though they could have and should have. They had no idea. They thought they were living in the immediate post-World War II period, when they could move the chess pieces around European politics pretty much at will. They can't anymore. They can't do it anywhere. They have the wrong army. They don't know how to fight. They produce too few weapons of those you need and too many of those you can't use. These are all signs of a loss of orientation. And what is true for them in the empire world, in the economic world, is becoming desperately true at home as well. The problems, and I'm speaking here to many of you that are not in Western Europe or not in North America. What you're watching now, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine or elsewhere, these are small skirmishes before the big event. I don't know exactly what that big event will be, but it'll have a lot to do with what's going on inside the United States, from which you are going to be shocked again and again, and perhaps as soon as a victory by Mr. Trump in less than 1 year, when we have our elections here. So that's one dimension of this transformation. And the other one is the mystery. I'm mystified by how and where the leadership in the People's Republic of China imagines the future of itself, of that experiment, of the larger BRICS community, which is a community of extraordinarily differently oriented, differently agendaed partners. I mean, where is all of this chaotic grouping going to go in a world as fast changing as this one is? I tried to chart big tendencies within that, but I'm very sensitive and aware of the many counter tendencies that I didn't have time to go into, to the internal contradictions even within the tendencies I'm talking about, those of you who think you're hearing the discussion of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, you are. Remember, the tendency, the internal contradictions, the counter tendencies. That's a very Hegelian way of setting up an issue. I would do that the same. If I had more time with you, we would talk about the internal contradictions in China, and they are there, and they have to do with the employer-employee relationship and all the struggles around the world as they confront all of this. And we do live at a time of extraordinary chaos. And let me say one other thing. I mean, I can't answer all of the issues you raised, but you were kind enough to say words about being involved in current events. I've always been involved in current events from the beginning. I thought that's one of the lessons I was to take from Marx, who was always active, always going and giving talks to organizations that were struggling on the job, in the streets, and so on. I've always done that. But I've done it not because of some abstract notion that Marx taught that. That would never have been enough. But I learned early on that you will get enormously powerful and productive insights into whatever theoretical work you do by immersing yourself in political struggle. You will learn things you cannot learn otherwise. When people turn against folks like us, professors, and worry us about the ivory tower, yeah, they may overstate the point, they may take it too far, but there's a big grain of real truth in what they feel, and we better be aware of it, because if not, we miss out. We need the economics profession to deal with these enormous issues. And it's a shame that the theoretical journals don't foster that, don't encourage it, don't reward it. And that's part of the reason why I do more of it, almost as if to spite them.
It was, I think, a wide question with raising concerns, but it was very interesting. So I had the privilege, as you know, to attend your economic seminars at the New School last Tuesday. So I will abuse this advantage to push a bit with respect to the role of China in BRICS.
Okay.
So early days, in the beginning of BRICS, there was a lot of excitement and concern with respect to what is actually happening. So what is this new union that has been formed? And of course, I'm sure you know Radhika Desai, who mentioned in one of her pieces in Guardian, and I'm going to quote here, that since the non-aligned movement and the demand for a new economic order in the 1970s, has the world seen such a coordinated challenge to Western supremacy in the world economy from developing countries. And as you know, the excitement was also shared by a lot of workers, socialist and communist parties, especially in a sense emphasizing the role of China and the Communist Party of China in this endeavor. Now, of course, there were also concerns and critiques. One could, for example, cite Vijaya Prasad, who mentioned that the BRICS agenda, and I'm quoting, is neoliberalism with Southern characteristics. There is no frontal challenge to Northern institutional hegemony or to their neoliberal policy framework. BRICS, as of now, is a conservative attempt by Southern powerhouses to earn themselves what they see as their rightful place on the world stage. And of course, as the experience of BRICS develops and we see how essentially it works in practice, especially if one could see Africa, I think the concerns are even more accentuated and more in increase. So one could say that the view that we have of China, who is undoubtedly the leader of BRICS, shapes our understanding of BRICS, the nature of BRICS itself. And to give you an example, if we understand that BRICS is an anti-imperialist bloc, then one could say that it is reasonable to argue that there can be class alliances with the dominant classes of BRICS against the world, the US imperialism, Western hegemony. So now to be more concrete with my question, and I will try to boil it down. So you mentioned China is hybrid socialist. I was wondering, how does this inform our understanding, of course, not only of China's hybrid socialist, but also the other countries that are participating in the BRICS, with respect to the nature of BRICS? And, we always seek for propositions. So I would have 3 propositions. Of course, you cannot choose any of them, but is it anti, sub, or inter-imperialist, the BRICS bloc? And if you want to push it a bit more, what do you think should be the class strategy of the working classes with respect to BRICS for what you say a genuinely socialist alternative?
Good. The left always looks and hopes for champions. This is an old tradition. If I had time, I'd tell you where I think it comes from, but in any case, it's an old tradition. So when something powerful arises that is in some way the enemy of the traditional capitalist, central imperialist power, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, when something arises that is in some fundamental way critical of them, the left sees an actual or at least a potential champion. So yes, of course, there have been many, as you rightly say, who see in the BRICS the socialist future, the new power that will unseat capitalism and capitalist imperialism, in this case, led by the United States. This is clearly not an adequate understanding because so many of the impulses involved in the BRICS are not interested in that at all. No matter what they say, that it's not what they do, it's not how they run their own economic systems. So that's one thing. On the other hand, it is extremely important that no one hegemon can organize the imperialist capitalist world. That gave the United States a great deal of power, but actually provided quite a bit of power to the other subordinate. The Europeans didn't have to spend money on military. They could develop their capitalism because the United States took care of it, etc., etc. There's no German development without the protective umbrella that the United States provided, and so on. So that you have to be very careful here. You don't want to miss what's going on. The notion that it's all the same, that India, China is just junior imperialism, maybe becoming senior, is the same kind of oversimplification as, on the other hand, making them the heroes who are going to make the socialist revolution. I don't think it's been resolved at all among the BRICS what it is they're going to do, how they're going to manage the disagreements already present among them. They are now discussing what to do vis-a-vis Ukraine. They are now discussing what to do vis-a-vis Gaza. And it's not clear that they're going to be able to reach a consensus of the sort that one might hope. I think these issues are being fought out inside each of them, including the People's Republic of China. What I would like to do, though, is to broaden. My hope is that the left will have its own agenda, will not be sitting there deciding who to cheer for, the declining empire or the rising one, or to wipe its hands and say, this has nothing to do with us. No, no, no. It has everything to do with the survival of the planet and therefore with the socialist project. So my hope is, can we define a socialist project that unifies the working classes both in the old centers of capitalism and the new ones. And let's remember, capitalism is not so stable. Every 4 to 7 years, it has a crash. It's the most unstable system imaginable. Through its early years in the West, it often came very close to socialist revolutions and dissolution of a society that was literally falling apart. They didn't have an easy time reconstructing themselves. Socialists at various times made crucial differences in them. Let's remember the socialist revolution succeeded in Russia to its point in a very poor, backward, under-industrialized country. Socialists can succeed in many environments. Do they have a program? Do they have an organization? Do they understand the weak points, the weak links, if you like? That's their job. And my hope was, here's a target, this organization, hierarchical, fundamentally anti-democratic. The boss is not accountable. We live in a world in which democracy has spread, at least as a form, as an idea, as a goal. And then socialism becomes the bearer of the program of bringing that ideal into the workplace from which it has been excluded for a long time. That gives socialism a goal, a target with which few will disagree. And that gives it a status, a role, a place to take advantage of however the old empire and the new empire struggle their way through the period we live in. If we don't do that, we will be stuck with the terms in which they define what the issues are. And my guess is most leftists will be very disappointed with how they define it, because that's been true now for 10 years. The struggle between the United States and China became really explicit over the last 10 years, and the terms of that debate leave socialists with nothing. It's not relevant. It doesn't connect. It's as if the hope of the anti-socialists that socialism would fade out of the picture has been achieved, because the terms on which China and the United States fight seem to have very little to do with that. When Chinese spokespersons remind us that they define their country as socialism with Chinese characteristics, what you actually observe is a great deal of focus on the Chinese characteristics and next to nothing about the so-called socialism. And that tells you quite a bit.
I mean, I think we got our answers with
Yes.
more thoughts and more concerns. But I mean, I think we can move forward.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yanni. This was also very interesting, as always. Okay, so we are overwhelmed by the amount of questions, actually. So let me just do some housekeeping. We have a good list of questions that already came in the chat. And this year, unlike last year, we are asking people to also raise their hands if they would like to ask the question themselves. So what we are going to do now, we're going to start reading the questions that came in one by one. But if anyone would like to ask the question themselves, please raise your hand and we will start a stack for that. So Yanni, let me pass it back to you with the first question that came in. I believe it's from Ian.
Yes, yes, absolutely. There are indeed many questions. Give me 1 second. All right, yes. And the question is from Ian. So Professor Wolff asked if you think that the rise of Milei in Argentina and his preemptive withdrawal from BRICS What do you think exactly? Well, okay. So what do you think of Milei in Argentina and his withdrawal from the BRICS? Does this point to a wider danger of cretinous, explicitly pro-imperialist populism spilling over from the Trump movement as previously with Bolsonaro? I think that's the first question.
Yes, I find the phenomena of Milei in Argentina and Bolsonaro very, very interesting, and let me tell you why. It does illustrate the heterogeneity of the BRICS, the very different places they all come from. That was already true, but I mean, becomes more true now. In terms of pronouncements, I think what we're watching here is a really interesting phenomena. In Brazil, I think I see it, in Argentina, and in many other countries. There is a deep disaffection of the mass of people from the existing political parties, more or less all of them. There is a sense that they have worked out a deal among themselves. So first this one will be in the government for a while, and then that one will be in the government, and that this is a very cozy arrangement, nice for them. The only thing it does for society as a whole is ensure that nothing much changes from one government to another. And change over the last 25 years is what has more and more become what the mass of people want, because the situation for them is deteriorating. The inequality around the world, however you measure it, is astonishing. It's astonishing on a global level among countries, with or without including China, which is the unique determinant in the statistics. But globally, within virtually every country, it's worse and worse. What I told you about the United States, inequality getting worse, is not unique to the United States. And I take that as an index for broad-based disaffection, anger, disinterest, withdrawal, all the forms that an angry working class takes when it cannot get the political or economic changes it knows it needs and wants. In that situation, the politicians do what politicians often do. They try to figure out, gee, if it isn't going to help my career to be in this party or that party, if that bores people, if that doesn't get anyone excited for me, what do I need to do to become appealing to some group of people and thereby make me stand out from the usual conventional politics? And I take as one example my own presidential candidate, Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump always was a brainless clown. He is a brainless, he has no serious education. He doesn't understand anything. He makes statements that are childish. But he does demonstrate that he is not like the conventional Republican and Democratic political machines. He is doing that to this day. I'm sure he's doing it as I speak to you. That is his only hope. And the more the establishment turns against him, the more popular he becomes and the more secure his base for him. Yeah, he's an Ivy League graduate. Because that's what rich people like his father did and do. They buy their children's way into fancy universities. It's very, very common, not unusual. And he was one of those. But like many of those, the university they go to is a outfit they wear, not a process they go into. I have taught at Harvard and Yale. I can assure you, half of my class, at least, was full of these young people who never open a book, who never study, who are there to have parties, to drink too much, and to do the usual activities about which they make jokes and about which they do not have a second thought. Their job is waiting for them when they're finished. They make fun of those of us who come from poorer backgrounds and are there to escape into their circle if we possibly can and rise up out of ours. And they, therefore, if they have any intellectual aspirations, Mr. Trump has none, never had any, never showed the slightest interest in any such thing. But if they do, then they will attach themselves to an ideological position that asks nothing of them, that gives them a very simple story to tell, because these are simple people. Milei has a simple story. Bolsonaro had a simple story. If you listen to Milei giving a speech, then you can understand his brain is as well ordered as his hairstyle. There's nothing there. He articulates the crudest libertarian nonsense imaginable. Here's how this goes. And you get this from the others too. And that's why there is a libertarianism. Everything that's wrong in the world is because of the government. The government is an intrinsically bad thing, and I'm going to get rid of the government, which is cute because I'm the government and I'm going to get rid of the government. And you hate the government anyway because you blame it for everything. And therefore, I'm going to be beating up on the thing you blame. Aren't we all together? Vote for me. And you won't hear the other politicians say this. So I'm the clown you should pick. And you know, for a disaffected, angry, bitter working class, that's a way to give the middle finger to the government, which is the most pleasure the election process affords. So they do it. I use the example of Brexit. Brexit is incompetent conservative politicians mobilize the anger of the British working class that they have abused by telling the working class their suffering is to be blamed on Europe. And so the working class, angry, gives the finger to Europe, which of course changes nothing in their situation, which they now understand. Took them 7 years to figure it out. It will take some time for the Argentinians to figure it out. But this is a colossal kind of joke that a dying system plays on itself. You have so alienated your mass of people that they turn against you in basically irrational ways because you've destroyed the organizations that might have given them a rational way out. You've destroyed their confidence in the institutions from which they might draw inspiration for interesting new political developments. You've squashed all those, but you've made their situation unbearable, so they explode and celebrate a jokester like Milei, who's going to close the central bank, who's going to use the US dollar instead of the Argentinian currency, who's going to close the government down, who's going to shut relations with the country's two major trading partners, Brazil and China. I mean, yeah, sure he is. He's going to do all of that. Yesterday, he announced there will be a period of pain. At this point, the world is, the only interesting question is, will this clown survive the pain he imposed? And to take an example of another one just like him, it didn't last too long for Boris Johnson either.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to move to question number 2, came in from Rashid Marcano Rivera. So the question is, to what extent does debt bear consequences for the US, considering MMT's perspective? Specifically, does debt incur without contributing to productive economic growth or aim for economic equality weaken the foundational principle of monetary sovereignty? And what would?
Yes. Okay. First of all, debt is a transaction that occurs in the world, and therefore it has all immense consequences directly and indirectly. The notion that you can breezily, not worry about debt, the way people used to say, there's a monetary economy and then there's a, quote, real economy, and we don't have to worry so much about the monetary. That's a none too subtle way of saying, I don't understand the monetary, so I'm going to focus on something else. Money is real. It's real like everything else in the world is real. The dreams you have are real. They're not real in the way that, a stone falling on your leg, that's a different kind of real. But to banish the dream as if it was not an occurrence that shapes who and what you do and are, that's a game I do not understand. Money is very real, and the debts we incur are real. It means we have to do things, as long as that debt is there, that are different from what we would have to do if the debt were not there. Because we manage our monetary system by means of debt creation, we literally create money as debt, imposes all kinds of behavior on us. The government, you may not like it, you may criticize them, but a government that is in debt uses that fact to cut back expenditure for children in schools, thereby impacting their education. That's a lot of real impact of the debt that they have. And merely imagining it otherwise is not a serious proposition. Let's suppose we had modern monetary theory and the government issued money in one of the ways that that's articulated when it needed to spend money, and then taxed people to pull the money out when inflation was a danger, and so on. Well, as many have pointed out, you don't need me for that. If you have to deal with this taxation, that's a real impact it's going to have. Who's going to be taxed? By how much? At what time? In what relationship to taxes on other parts of an economy? These are all monumentally powerful, real decisions that will impact production, consumption, circulation, distribution, you name it. So for me, all of this is very, very real. And let me give you some examples. We have a higher level of corporate debt in the United States than we have ever had. Now, why do we have that? We have it because the instability of American capitalism took a very serious turn in this new century. We have had 3 crashes: 20, 2000, 2008, 2020. Arguably each one worse than the one before, but the last 2 among the most severe economic contractions in the history of capitalism. Spectacular collapses here in the United States. Terror in the Federal Reserve already at the beginning of the century with the dot-com crisis, that the crisis in the stock market and the crisis in the corporate sector would lead to a general depression. Solution to that problem, dropping interest rates in a way we have never seen before, to long-term historic lows, in some cases negative, below zero interest rates. Desperate. What the low interest rates for the last 20 years until last year, what they have meant is that every American corporation, let me underscore this, virtually every American corporation that had an economic problem solved it in the fastest, easiest, cheapest way, which was by borrowing limitless amounts of money from the Federal Reserve at a virtual zero interest rate. You created, to save capitalism, a situation that plunged your corporate sector into levels of debt that allow us to say in recent years that roughly 1/5, 20% of American corporations qualify for the term zombie corporation. And what a zombie corporation is a corporation whose net profit is not sufficient to service the debt that they've accumulated. So they are, in effect, bankrupt. But you don't bankrupt them because money will be borrowed by them to cover their debts and to keep going. And the hope is they'll find a way to return to profitability net of interest, even though it doesn't look like it. Okay, this has enormous consequences. These corporations are not able to make decisions the way they once did. Borrowing for a new technology runs into the problem that they already carry too much debt. So they have to forego that. They can't do it. Their ability to merge or to be merged changes with the estimation of creditors. If decisions are made elsewhere to limit the amount of debt you will do business with, these corporations can't do business anymore because they're already carrying too much debt. The point, the debt matters enormously in hundreds of ways, direct and indirect. We keep coming close in this country to a political stalemate over the annual budget, which is really a stalemate about debt levels. Republicans are protecting the rich and the corporations who don't want to be taxed to repay debt. And of course, if you don't tax them, their solution is cut the spending. And the proposals to cut spending by the Republicans, like the proposals to cut spending by Milei in Argentina, if they are carried out, if even they're carried out at 50% of what they are asking for, will produce revolutionary upheaval in the United States. And that changes everything. So we're talking about very serious economic problems being handled by expansions of debt, not because that solves the problem. It never did that. It just creates new problems. But what debt does, and this is crucial, is postpone the problem. That's why politicians love it, because they can vote now to increase the debt, assuming that they will move up in their career to another position so that servicing the debt will be on who comes in after them, not on them. The crazy dysfunctionality of capitalist economics with politics, which is a serious, long-standing problem, shows up in the crazy problem of debt because it is occurring at the point of dysfunctional connection between capitalism as an economic system and the parliamentary voting form of democracy that they have found convenient, but do not understand the risks. They're not Hegelians. They don't understand that if you adopt a form that supports you, you better pay attention to the way that same form undermines you, because if you don't, the undermining will go so far that you won't be able to survive.
I think it was a full answer. And I know Professor Wolff is a passionate presenter. So in order for him to catch a breath, it's a very, as I see in the chat happening, is a very interesting discussion and exchanges that range from humoristic to historical. So I think that's very nice. And I think we can continue that to next lectures as well. And also I want to share with you, Professor Wolff, that there is interest on your bookshelf. And what type of books are there, and perhaps some suggestions. Just this to catch a breath before me actually discussing with you the next question, which is interesting and has to do actually with the alternatives that are suggested. So let me go to the online doc and draw the questions. Okay, so this question comes from Dylan, who is from SOAS. He's a PhD economics student. So he mentions, you advocate worker co-ops as an alternative form of social production. What do you think of the friendly left critiques of this approach from a democratic planning / workers' council perspective? He's thinking of the recent works like People's Republic of Walmart by Lee Phillips and Michael Rozovsky, and No Bosses by Michael Albert. And in that regard, I think it's an extension of the question. How do you see these worker cooperatives, in a sense, leading us towards decommodification?
Sure. The cooperative movement, co-ops, is very old. It's important to remember it exists for thousands of years in human history. It is not new. Human beings have tried to get together and work in the sense of using their brains and muscles to produce consumable goods and services for a long time. Archaeologists show us that, anthropologists show us that, historians of all kinds show us that. There's an instinct, there's an array of circumstances and situations that lead human beings to do that, number one. Number two, it is always possible that a form like that changes its social meaning depending on the circumstances within which it exists. You all know that. A gesture in one context carries a completely different message from the same gesture in another context. Co-ops can do different things, play different roles. The left-wing critique of co-ops most of the time took the following form. We, the working class, are caught in a struggle with the oppressor, the ruling class, the class that owns the means of production, however you want to put it. And we are engaged in a struggle, not just with the other class, but to end this class system. And we need all the workers to understand the importance, the priority of this struggle. If some workers leave the struggle and go off to the corner and form a co-op, they will be busy taking time, energy, creativity, passion, politics away from the struggle we have with the boss in order to fashion an alternative. This weakens our struggle, and we are therefore critical. Don't do that. Number one. Here in the United States, it took the following form. There have been powerful cooperative movements of workers wanting to set up a cooperative enterprise. After World War II, when the Cold War settled in and the raison d'etre of American imperialism replacing the colonialisms of Britain and France and Belgium and all the others, the ideological way of doing that was to denounce communism. At least that was how it was done at home. But if you did that, then you put the cooperatives in a dangerous domestic situation. They were attacked as the seeds of communism here in the United States. And the cooperative movement, terrified by what was being done to communists, socialists, anarchists, and so on, began a very strong program, quite successful, to portray the co-op as a warm, friendly, human alternative for good people that was in no way critical of capitalism, in no way oppositional to capitalism. It was just a way, and the implication was clear, for people who didn't fit into capitalism to have a place to go. And capitalists were told, don't object to the worker co-op. The worker who might have been a troublesome person in your business is now busy with other troublesome persons developing what was mostly rural or small-scale worker co-ops, which of course fed in to the left's notion that the critic, the agitator, would be in the co-op area. It has been very difficult, therefore, to reach the American cooperative movement. And there's a big movement in the United States today. We have an association called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops, which is a service organization linking and serving all the co-ops in the United States. And there are many. But they are afraid of what I say. They are afraid of seeing or thinking of the co-op as an alternative with which to fight against capitalism, as a way to transform the system from one based on capitalistically organized enterprises into one based on worker self-directed enterprises, which is how we call worker co-ops here. So we are in a struggle to get away from the object of left criticism. We are not advocating leaving the class struggle. We are advocating making clear that the class struggle is not only against the worker, the employer, but it is offering an alternative to the employer. Let me put it in a more immediate way you may understand. I spend a lot of my time working with labor union leaders, getting them to understand, as many do, that there needs to be a better arsenal in the union to fight the employer. What do I mean? At this point, we demand higher wages, better working conditions, and all of that, and maybe a little bit of say in running the enterprise. And the capitalists push back. And one of the things the capitalists push back is, If you do that, I will shut the business. If you do that, I will sell this business to a big corporation who won't do it with you. Or if you do that, I will leave the country and relocate elsewhere where I don't have to face this. At which point, a difficult moment arises for the workers. This is a bit like playing poker. Do you call the bluff and risk no job at all? Or do you compromise? I arrive and I say, you don't have that choice. Here's another option. You should be able to say to the employer, go, we don't want you. Leave, sell. It's fine with us, because you know what we're going to do? We are now going to go to the political structure and we're going to say to the governor or the senator or the president or the mayor, you can keep these jobs, keep the revenue, keep the taxes, keep the people and the community happy, keep the jobs here by financing us, the workers, to take over the enterprise and make it a worker co-op. If you do, the jobs will be saved. If you don't, we will make sure you're never elected again. You will be the man or woman who failed to use the co-op as the solution to an employer who resists a reasonable compromise with the union. We are making good progress in adding the threat of a co-op to the arsenal of labor unions in struggles. And we are working with them to realize that threat, so it's not an empty threat, to create examples around the United States that we can point to say, you see, it happened there. You see, it happened there. It can happen to you again. That's a way of introducing the worker co-op, not only as a much better way of organizing society, which we do, but also as something that can practically enter into labor capital struggles across the board right now.
If I may do a brief comment on what you said, especially for the worker co-ops and some existing left critiques. When I was reviewing the Greek translation of your book, Democracy at Work, A Cure Against Capitalism, I think you mentioned towards the end of your book that essentially what you're suggesting is not a manual or an exact blueprint, but what you actually seek is to open a discussion, which also includes the problems and the challenges that this type of organization includes. And I think that's very important to understand that it's an open question. And I think that's something that requires us who might be sympathizing with socialist alternatives to seek deeper into this option and find also and address the challenges that come with that idea. So maybe Hanin...
Let me just say, I wish I could at this moment show you a 3-minute video to illustrate what you're saying. And the video would be of meetings, union meetings, where I go and where you can see after the presentation, you can see the excitement in those workers, because for the first time, somebody has sparked in them an excitement about the imaginary role they would place for themselves in an enterprise where they were part of the employer and not just an employee. This is an exciting reopening of possibilities. In the long run, that will be the most productive thing I can do. They'll come up with the mechanisms and the details and the experiments that we will all learn from. Our job now is in this way. And by the way, footnote, not only do I do it with co-ops, but if the audience can handle it, a judgment I have to make, then I tell them that's what 21st century socialism means. It's not about government or private, which are the shareholders. This is about you every day in your workplace playing a completely different role, developing different skills, having different responsibility. It is a transformation from the bottom up. And it means socialism will be something very important for you to get, to hold on to shape, which you'll be able to do. And you should see this is the excitement, I suspect, socialists in the 19th century had when they first introduced the idea that the people could run the government.
That's very interesting. Perhaps if you have a link or a video of that, that would be interesting. Yeah. But I think that you actually raised the point of challenging collective imagination that sometimes seems very fixed, and perhaps some things seem very naturalized in a sense. But Hanin, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I think we're going to slightly shift gears. So this question is coming from Saikirian Natinti. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. And the question is, I was intrigued by your observation that the anger against inequality in the US is now seeing the left as its savior, a shift from its earlier reliance on the right. Also, do you also see it as setting a trend in the shift away from identity politics, or what occupied the social movement studies, new social movements, to struggles centered around class? So this question is interesting because it's making connections between identity politics and the left and the right. And I would also actually like to emphasize that. And I would like to know what you think this movement in identity politics, where it's headed, and what's its relationship to what's coming next for labor and for unionizing, and in the context that you are also suggesting of co-ops.
Okay. The way to answer this question requires reminding you, although I know most of you know this, that the period after World War II was one of the most sustained ideological campaigns that I know of in the history of the world. There were many, but this is one of the most intense. Please remember that during the 1930s, the American working class, stung by the Great Depression, moved sharply to the left. Starting in 1929, American workers joined labor unions on a scale they had never done before. Mostly people whose parents had never been in the union, who had themselves never been in the union. They were led by the miners' workers, the people who went down into the coal mines and the iron mines. And likewise, in the 1930s, tens of thousands of Americans joined two socialist and one communist party. And those parties became very big. And an alliance called the New Deal Coalition was formed between the CIO, that was the parent organization of the workers unionizing, and the two socialist and the communist parties. They worked together, literally, to organize factory by factory, with the political people organizing the workers into the union, and the most activist, the most developed workers would then also join the socialist or the communist parties. What was achieved by this was a swing to the left that this country had never seen before, and that the United States has never seen since. You need to understand that. In a very few years, the Social Security system was created. The government will give you, if you're 65 years of age or older, a check every month for the rest of your life because you've spent a life working. A pension, in short. Number two, a minimum wage, a decent one. Number three, unemployment compensation. If you lose your job through no fault of your own, the government will give you money every week for a year or two. And finally, public jobs. Roosevelt, the president, created 15 million jobs at a time when tens of millions of people were unemployed. And where did the money come from to pay for all of it? The government had no money. We were in depression. Nobody was paying taxes because nobody was working. The money came from the only place the money could come, corporations and the rich, who were taxed much higher than they had been before. So this country taxed corporations and the rich to produce the greatest array of social programs the country had ever seen. At the end of World War II, when the Depression had been overcome by putting people to work for war, when the war was over, President Roosevelt died, the business community understood that it had to roll back the New Deal. It had to crush this unheard of, never before seen lurch to the left toward social democracy. So they undertook the most thorough campaign that I can think of to crush everything on the left. And they succeeded in doing that. Anybody who talked like a socialist, who seemed to take economics seriously, who used words like class, or even words like capitalism, anything that sounded or looked like it was that, you were considered a Soviet spy or worse. Okay, why is this relevant? Because politics didn't stop. People abused and mistreated didn't stop noticing that, didn't stop fighting. But when they fought for something better, they understood don't have anything to do with socialists or communists or anything that looks or sounds or talks like that. So you must be anti-racist. That you could do. Anti-sexist. That you could do. Ecologically sensitive. That you could do. You could have a identity as a non-white, as a female, and all the others. But you had to keep away from the economics. The socialists, who were always among the anti-racists, the feminists, and so on, hid their interest in socialism, kept them quiet, did not push these organizations to be allied in any public way with anything on the left. Okay? Now, to be fair, the old socialist and communist organizations, even when they were strong, tended to want everyone to think of themselves as a socialist or as a communist or as a labor union activist, and they were afraid that any other identity, if you were a female unionist or a black communist, you don't want to dilute the importance of the struggle, so that what we now call social movements in those days existed inside the socialist and communist parties or inside the unions, where they were careful not to stress that identity, and the leaders of those organizations did the same. What that produced was a deep suspicion on the part of the leaders of anti-racist, anti-sexist, environmental. They were very afraid of anybody in their organizations who began to push in directions of alliances or coalitions with socialists and communists, especially if they were publicly so. That was understood to be a very dangerous, may have been well-intentioned, but it was a dangerous thing to do in a country that was as hysterically anti-socialist and anti-communist. Even the labor unions did the same. They functioned as a special identity. I'm a labor activist. I'm not a feminist. Obviously, you can be a labor activist and a feminist also, as many were. But these things had to be, all right. What is new now? What is new is that the labor movement is both reappearing in American society. It had been on a decline. Remember, the campaign that I told you about against the left was very successful from 1945 to the present. The Communist Party virtually disappears in the United States. The two socialist parties virtually disappear. There's a new one now, Democratic Socialists of America. You've heard about them. That's a new, super moderate socialist, very new, basically brought into existence by Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and people like that. But in general, there remains a taboo. I am an unusual economist in the United States. We have many left-wing economists, but clearly and openly saying, "Oh, I'm a Marxist. I'm deeply impressed by Marx. I've learned to." People are afraid to do that, and I'm not courageous. But because I'm a product of the elite universities in this country, I can get a job because I went to the right university despite my politics, whereas that would be the end of the career for many, many others. That's the truth of it. It has nothing to do with me. It has to do with this situation. The revival of the labor movement now and the revival of a moderate, but still, there it is, socialism, the demonstration of enormous importance that a man who did not reject the label socialist, Bernie Sanders, could get millions of Americans to vote for him, broke the taboo. And it is changing, and fast, in the United States. So now it becomes possible to talk, at least in a general way, about quote unquote intersectionality. It's not accidental that that very idea could be picked up and now talked about for a couple of decades, about intersections of race and class and sexuality and politics and labor, and all of these things affecting one another. The irony is that the suspicion has been inherited by a new generation. They still suspect the motivations of those who want to break down the separations of these identities and welcome them and talk about how we can make a unified movement that doesn't disrespect the differences amongst us, but builds on them, recognizes them, fosters them, not out of fear that we won't be united, but as a basis for making everybody welcome together. That's happening here, happening slowly, but it is happening here. And most important, it is being led by the labor movement, which before was largely absent, didn't want to participate at all. I go around the country urging labor unions to understand that what was achieved in the 1930s, which the labor movement recognizes as its great historical past, was achieved because of the coalition between a powerful labor movement and the socialist and communist parties. But because those parties aren't here now, I tell them, what was inside those parties, the social movements, are now outside those parties and are self-sustaining social movements of feminists and anti-racists and all the rest of it. But the need for a coalition remains. And the good news, the labor movement is more than ever open and willing to make those alliances, and the social movements likewise. So I think we are we're not where we want to be, but there is the breakdown of capitalism has as one of its many complications the increase in the numbers and strength of the labor movement and of the social movements, and a growing recognition that they ought to work together and can achieve more together than they can separately. And the history in the 30s is the crucial proof of how that can work, because Americans are amazed to learn their own history about how successful a movement to the left has already been in American history. Makes it less difficult to imagine it being successful in that way again.
Yes, Professor Wolff, thank you for that. This moment,
I'm a little terrified because I look at the chat, and with each question we answer, there's many more that are arriving.
which is great. That only goes to show how exciting this conversation truly is. But unfortunately, we're out of time.
Yes.
So we're going to have to wrap up. But I was going to say one little thing is that this moment truly seems like a moment where not being a political participant is no longer an option. This idea of being neutral, or this idea of just going with the status quo, seems to be not an option anymore. And I personally can just see this from what's happening on the streets only in the past 2 months. So I think we're in an interesting moment, and you gave us so much to think about today. And I really hope that we will continue this conversation.
Well, so do I. This is what I do. This is what I want to do. And if you want to arrange it again, let me know. I will be glad to do it again.
Yes, we do, and we will.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Take care.